silent scan.
Underground grid connected. Please insert your passkey. Passkey accepted. Downloading payload. The Deep, Part 1. There's a small creek on the other side of Flickinger Hill. It lies at the edge of the forest, just beyond the line of houses. I think it's been 10 years since the last time I saw it. We used to play there when we were kids, spending hours building little boats out of sticks and paper, racing them down the little bends and rapids where the steady flow wound its way over tree roots and sharp bits of rock. We'd grown up playing in the woods. The dense pine forest had become our haven, a place we could go play, the only place in town we weren't always looking over our shoulders for the listening ears and watchful eyes of the monitors. There were always ears and eyes for hire. Even children our own age weren't exempt. Sometimes it was the ones so easy to overlook who made the best informants. Although we often knew which kids to avoid, there were still those coerced by desperate parents or impressed by whispered promises. That's why the forest felt like home. It was the one place we could most be like ourselves. Yes, the forest had always felt like a safe place. We should have known better. Nowhere is truly safe in this place. It was Thomas who'd suggested we go further into the woods that day, far past the creek where it eventually met its much larger brother. It wasn't the first time we had gone down there, not even the second or the third, but going out that deep into the woods, where a scream for help could no longer reach our parents, required a certain level of caution. Despite the freedom we often felt out in nature, we knew the forest came with its own variety of risks, both natural and those who enforced the rules of our province. I shifted uncomfortably on my feet. There wasn't a particular reason I could at the time put my finger on, but the idea made me uneasy. It was like there was a tension in the air that day, a buzz of something almost electric. I felt Trey slide his hand into mine and give it a light squeeze. His touch had a way of easing the tension in my body, of drawing it out until it disappeared. It was Trey's special talent. He just had a sort of grounding presence. Steady, kind, always there. It was no wonder those on the other side of the track had taken such a liking to him. I looked back to Thomas to find him eyeing our hands. When he felt my gaze, he quickly looked away. It wasn't the bewildered, contemptible, or suspicious looks the town folk sometimes gave us for seeing a boy of Trey's high family status on this side of the trolley tracks. Thomas and Trey were as close as any of us. No, I suspected it had more to do with that longing way he sometimes looked at me, the one we all noticed from time to time, but pretended not to, myself included. I released Trey's hand and shoved mine into my pockets, feeling a tinge of guilt I didn't quite understand. I towed a rock before realizing I was the only one of the 5 of us who hadn't voted yet. Sensing the silence had stretched on too long, I looked at the faces of my friends. They were all watching me with patient expressions. "We made a pact," Trey said in that calm, quiet way of his. "Right," added Addison. "Unanimous or we don't go." It wasn't a feeling of pressure that was preventing me from conceding. It was that odd hollowness in my gut, that electric tension that seemed to prickle against my skin. But it was so silly to feel so anxious, right? We'd gone into the deep several times, nothing bad had ever happened. So why did this time feel different? Trey shifted his weight just enough for me to feel the warmth of his body behind mine. He didn't touch me this time, didn't interfere, but it was his quiet way of offering support by making his presence felt. It was one of the things I loved most about him. I had been silent too long, caught in a hesitation brought on by a lingering dread I couldn't quite explain. I could feel the concern rising in the others. Their expressions had shifted, waiting, watching. I took a breath and forced a small smile. "Right, let's go," I said finally. They all waited a beat, like they weren't sure if I meant it, like they were bracing for me to change my mind. But when I stepped towards the trees, they quickly followed suit without question. As we made our way deeper and deeper into the woods, the more my nerves began to settle. The tension in the air hadn't lifted, but nothing felt overtly wrong. The forest hummed with its usual rhythm, the quiet rustle of wind through the pines, the distant call of birds, the creak of old branches. It helped fuel the argument I was having with myself, that this was nothing more than a strange bout of paranoia, or maybe just the side effect of too little sleep. I never slept well during power outages. Something about the silence in the house when the current cut out made the night feel heavier. Thomas was leading the way, as he always did. He whistled as he walked, light and carefree, the tune drifting lazily through the trees. It felt oddly out of place beside the lingering unease I couldn't shake. He twirled a short stick in the air like a baton, conducting his own music with every step. Addison and Bentley followed behind him, side by side, half laughing at something I hadn't caught. Trey and I brought up the rear, our pace more measured, more quiet. The Deep wasn't just what we called the stretch of forest beyond the creek near Flickinger Hill. It was also the name we gave to the creek's much larger, darker brother, too wide and too fast to be a simple creek, but not quite big enough to be a river. Its steep, uneven banks carved a natural barrier through the land, marking the edge of the hunting grounds on the far side. Although we had sometimes played in the shallows out of the reach of the currents, we never ventured too close to its opposite bank. No one did. Aside from the danger of the hunters mistaking us for game, the things that prowled the land on that side of the banks were enough to give even the hunters pause during certain parts of the year, and ensure they went out in larger hunting parties. Besides, everyone knew the hunting grounds were dangerous, but not just because of the predators. That was flock territory, and it was heavily regulated. Firearms were reserved exclusively for the flock, who always accompanied the hunting parties. Civilians, even hunters, were never permitted to carry weapons without supervision. Like everywhere else in the country, the public was not allowed to bear arms, and hunters were no exception. The few weapons they were issued were closely monitored, and the number of armed flock always outnumbered the people they were assigned to oversee. Still, an arrow or a well-aimed spear could be just as lethal as a bullet to the wrong target, and accidents weren't uncommon. Bentley's mother, the town doctor, could vouch for that. Every season brought a new wave of injuries to her table. Venomous snake bites, poison ivy rashes, animal maulings, and every now and then, a misfire that needed quiet stitching. Aside from the wildlife, the heavy flock presence alone was enough to put anyone on edge. All flock were unwelcome, being that they were hand-picked, militarized enforcers chosen by the government to keep the provinces in line. And while all of them posed a threat, some gave you more reason to be afraid than others. The trees began to thin as we neared the banks of the Deep. Thomas stopped whistling. No matter how many times we'd come out here, we always grew more alert upon arrival. He turned to glance back at us and motioned for us to hold our position while he and Trey went to scout ahead. The idea of splitting up made my stomach twist, but the unease was short-lived. Both boys reappeared within seconds. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The cut banks of the Deep looked steeper than usual. The recent dry spell had dropped the water level, leaving behind striking bands of color etched along the edges, faint lines marking where the surface used to sit. I noticed Thomas eyeing them too, a small grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Bet you we can make it to the middle with the water this low," he said, glancing back at us with a familiar glint of mischief in his blue eyes. The damp blonde strands of his hair clung to his forehead in loose curling tendrils in the humid air. It was as if the canopy was holding in the heavy, heated air. Bentley, always the first to dive into adventure, grinned wide. Addison smirked, arms crossed, clearly game for the challenge. "Race you there," she said, and before any of us could react, she was already gone. "Hey, cheater!" Bentley shouted, laughing as she bolted after her, Thomas right on her heels. I turned to Trey, ready to break into a light jog to catch up, but he caught my hand instead. His brown eyes met mine, searching. They seemed unusually bright today, the flecks of honey bronze catching the soft light filtering through the canopy above. Something's bothering you. It wasn't a question, just a gentle observation. Trey had a way of seeing people, even those unlike me who didn't wear their emotions out in the open. He was observant in a way that was unusual for a merchant's kid from the other side of the tracks. I always wondered if it was a skill he had learned or if it was just simply him. I took a steadying breath, unsure where to start or how to explain. Instead, I simply shrugged, hoping the gesture might say what words couldn't. His gaze lingered on me for a long moment, assessing before he spoke. "Just say the word, and we'll leave," he said, his voice low. I nodded once, and we both took off jogging in the direction of our friends. We found them just minutes later, crouched low, inspecting something concealed among the brush by the bank. As we drew closer, Thomas and Bentley seemed to vanish beneath the foliage, leaving Addison standing with her arms crossed and an exasperated frown. Her eyes lifted when she saw us. "There you are," she said, her tone tinged with frustration. "I keep telling these two we should leave, but they won't listen to reason." A similar frown tugged at my brows as we closed the distance and finally saw what they were looking at. "It looks like a camp," Thomas said, his tall frame ducking awkwardly as he emerged from the makeshift tent that had been dug into the sandy edges of the bank. The tent was crafted with surprising skill, built from little more than a small piece of tarp and some twine. It blended seamlessly with the natural brush, well enough that it was almost a miracle they'd spotted it at all. Bentley, who had been crouched to peer inside, straightened, her face marked with curiosity. "But who would want to camp all the way out here?" she wondered aloud. Thomas shrugged, hands settling on his hips. "Looks like whoever left in a hurry," he said casually. "There were boots inside." "I don't like it. We should go," Addison said, her tone turning serious. "For all we know, it could have been—" She glanced around cautiously before lowering her voice to a whisper. "Degenerates." Bentley sucked in a sharp breath, her face paling. She shot a look at Thomas. "You didn't touch anything, did you?" she squeaked. Thomas shook his head, while Addison rolled her eyes. "Please," Addison began in a flat tone. "Degeneration hasn't been contagious in years." "That we know of," Bentley shot back. "My mom said she heard the virus still pops up in other provinces." The uneasiness I felt earlier curled into my stomach like a cat, reminding me it hadn't gone anywhere. I looked over at Trey, hoping for some reassurance, but he was focused on scanning the woods. I must have squeezed his hand without realizing it, because he glanced at me, then interrupted the others' bickering. "I'm with Addison," Trey said. "Whoever left seems to be gone. We shouldn't be here when they come back." "If they come back," Addison muttered under her breath. A heavy silence fell over us. No one moved, all of us staring at each other, the weight of what we just uncovered hanging in the air. "Well," Thomas finally broke the silence, his voice strained. "Anyone still want to see if we can get to the middle rocks?" His tone was confident, but the quick glance he threw in Trey's direction told me that even Thomas was feeling uncertain now, though he'd never admit it. "Is that safe?" Addison asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. "The water's low. Maybe lower than it's been in years," Trey replied, his tone steady. "For all we know, the hunters set up a lookout to keep predators from wandering over the deep. Besides, I doubt anyone on the run would camp right across from known flock territory." "That would explain the camouflage," Addison added. "Okay. Rocks then?" Everyone nodded, though the enthusiasm was missing. A wary look had settled on all our faces, and even though Trey's explanation made sense, we were all a little jumpy as we made our way down to the rocks we'd jumped across countless times before. The mood lightened soon enough, though. Thomas had been right. The water level was low enough that many of the rocks normally submerged had surfaced. Naturally, he'd already made it to the farthest one, his long legs easily clearing the gaps between. He now stood triumphantly on the largest, flattest rock jutting just past the middle of the deep, arms raised like he'd won something, before plopping down to bask in the sun. Trey and I clapped quietly from the dry rock we were perched on, while Addison and Bentley tossed sticks into the current to watch them drift. I think it might actually be safe to swim in, Bentley mused, tossing a larger branch and watching it slowly catch the current. I think you might be right. The current's not nearly as strong with the water this low, Addison replied. Bentley, clearly taking that as a green light, immediately began peeling off her shoes. I lifted a hand to block a sunbeam cutting through the trees, watching her. She was a strong swimmer, probably the strongest of all of us. I'd seen her tear across the lake plenty of times during the summer, but none of us had ever dared to swim in the deep before. Then again, the water had never looked so calm. Are you sure about this? I asked, my voice edged with nerves. Bentley glanced back at me, her expression full of mischief, dark hair flicking over one shoulder. We're about to find out, she said, and before anyone could stop her, she slid into the water and vanished beneath the surface. Trey and Thomas shot to their feet, instinctively bracing in case something went wrong. But then Bentley popped back up, grinning wide, her dark head bobbing as she treaded water with surprising ease, barely drifting in the slow current. The next thing I knew, everyone was splashing in the water, laughing, shouting, sending ripples echoing across the surface. I smiled and perched on a rock closer to the middle for a better view. It was rare seeing all of us like this. It wasn't often we could afford to be so carefree. And Trey, he was breathtaking when he smiled. The kind of smile that made your heart ache in the best way. After a while, he climbed out, water sliding off him in slow rivulets. The sun glinted off the droplets in his curls, catching the light in the afternoon sun. I loved his hair when it was wet. His curls always looked softer, more defined. He peeled his drenched shirt over his head and laid it out across the rock to dry. A breeze stirred, raising goosebumps along his golden skin. He gave a soft laugh as he sat down beside me. See something you like? He asked, voice low and teasing. Heat rushed to my face and I looked away. He chuckled again. It's okay. You can look at me if you want. It doesn't bother me. I glanced over at him, catching the curve of his mouth as he watched our friends drifting downstream. There was something in his expression, calm, content, like this moment meant something to him too. The sunlight caught on the long lashes framing his eyes, and that crooked grin tugged at his dimple again. I could tell he loved seeing our friends like this too. You've been shy with me lately, he said softly. He wasn't looking at me, but I knew the words were meant for me. Not sure why. We've grown up together. He rested his chin on his arm, then turned to look at me, his gaze steady. Nothing's changed. But it had. Everything had changed. At least, it had for me. I resisted the urge to fidget under the weight of his golden eyes and forced myself to hold his stare. I opened my mouth, unsure of what I even meant to say, but he spoke first. I feel the same, he said with a small grin. So like I said, you don't have to feel shy around me. I blinked. What? I managed. Trey just gave me that crooked grin of his, the one that made it hard to think straight. Like I said, nothing's changed, he breathed. Hey, Trey, Thomas called from farther down the rocks. You want to help me out? And just like that, Trey was up and moving towards him. I watched, still stunned, as he bent to clasp Thomas's wrist, the lean muscle in his back flexing with the motion. But then he looked back at me, and everything shifted. The grin vanished. His body went rigid. His eyes, usually so warm, hardened as they narrowed, walking onto something behind me. This is Blake C. Holloway. We hope you have enjoyed this production of The Deep, Part 1 by Blake C. Holloway. This program was produced and directed by B. Holla Entertainment. Text copyright 2025 by Blake C. Holloway. Production copyright 2025 by B. Holla Entertainment. All rights reserved. This is a copyrighted work. Unauthorized copying or distribution is a crime. Transmission terminated.